Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ZSL online event as part of the Great Big Green Week, which is a week of events across the UK celebrating action on climate change. My name is Holly Bestley, and I am one of the Senior Learning Officers at ZSL, and I'm going to be your host for this afternoon's event. As the world's leaders gear up for the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow at the end of October, organisations continue to push for effective and sufficient action on the climate crisis. But we know that biodiversity, species, ecosystems across the world are also in crisis. For example, the Living Planet report from 2020, produced by ZSL and WWF, recorded a 68% fall in vertebrate species populations since 1970. New research released just this week, led by ZSL's climate and biodiversity experts, has stated that these global emergencies must be tackled together and that nature-based solutions must become a priority. So over the next hour, we are going to take a whistle-stop tour around the world. We're going to go from coasts to forests and from the Philippines right back to the UK shores to explore some of the ZSL work that links these two issues together. We would really like to hear from you too, anyone who is watching this. You can ask our speakers your questions during the event using what's called the Pigeonhole platform. There's no sign up or registration required for this. It's very, very simple to use. If you just head to the address on the screen at present, www.pigeonhole.at/1826, anytime during the event, pop your questions on there. You can also on there upvote questions that have already been placed if you would like to hear their answers too. And we will be endeavouring to put these to our speakers throughout the event and at a dedicated section towards the end too. So joining us today to shed some light on this topic, we have Natalie Pettarelli, a conservation scientist working on nature-based solutions, particularly rewilding. We have Tungaleg Ulambayar, an ecologist protecting rangeland ecosystems and associated wildlife in Mongolia. Heather Calderway, a conservation biologist involved with marine protected areas in the Indian Ocean and beyond. And Alison Debney, a marine conservationist restoring coastal habitats here in the UK. So first up, we'll start with Natalie. You have done a huge amount of work on both of these issues, biodiversity and climate change. And in fact, you are the lead author on the paper that has been released this week. Would you be able to explain, to start off with, in a nutshell, what is the link between the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis? What are nature-based solutions that you're encouraging that we need to use? And why do they need to be such a large part of the climate change solution?
Hi, Oli. So I think that people do understand quite well how climate change may impact wildlife. So how rapidly changing climatic conditions can directly threaten the long-term survival of many species. For example, a lot of people can think about the polar bear or other species where we know that changes in temperature or rainfall can really affect their survival. We also have heard a little bit as to how species are changing their distribution in response to climate change, those species on the move, trying to catch up with the condition, the environmental condition that they generally thrive in, and how that has triggered slow movement, a lot of species in the United Kingdom moving up north, for example, a lot of moth and butterfly. And those changes in distribution, we know a little bit that they may impact ecosystem functioning and ecosystem stability because new species are arriving in new environment and may disrupt what is generally happening in those ecosystems. What people may sometimes not really think about is how the rapid degradation and or the loss of ecosystem can really reduce our planet's ability to store carbon and therefore deepen the climate change crisis. So think, for example, about mangroves, those incredible ecosystems that do a lot of stuff for nature and humanity. They are a biodiversity hotspot, but one of the incredible advantages of mangrove is that they are extremely good at capturing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it into the ground. And they do that super effectively while also protecting community from extreme climatic events and while being important fish nursery. And then therefore basically underpinning a lot of major fish stocks. What we also don't think systematically about is how climate change can strengthen the drivers of the loss of nature. One good example is on land use change. So we know that agricultural expansion is really a big driver of biodiversity loss. Now, climate change, changing climatic condition can put more stress on farmers or anyone that relies on natural resources for their livelihood, which can therefore intensify those drivers and precipitate or deepen the climate change crisis, as well as the biodiversity one. And then maybe also something that not everybody think about is how the impact of climate can actually impact our conservation efforts, so our ability to protect nature. So these interlinkages between the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis have been discussed for a while now, and there's really huge consensus that there's a lot of sense in trying to address them in unison. And this is where the concept of nature-based solution comes from. Now, very put simply, a nature-based solution is basically, it involves working with nature to address big challenges, such as climate change, but also, for example, water insecurity or food insecurity. And those solutions, what's really incredible about them is that they are supposed to provide benefit for both human well-being and for biodiversity. So it's if well implemented, it's a win-win scenarios where biodiversity wins and it helps us tackle for example, the climate change crisis. Now, the benefits of nature-based solutions. So it would, if in a nutshell, it's a solution that would help us increase carbon sequestration or reduce the impact of climate change on people and living organisms, provide biodiversity, and what's really important, if you compare them to other solutions to climate change, is that they tend to be low cost, low risk, and low maintenance. Now, you may wonder, what can you give me any example of nature-based solution? But the two major one would be a protected area and a restoration project. So protecting ecosystems such as tropical forests, which are also really good at capturing carbon, seagrasses and mangroves, or restoring seabeds and peatlands, something we're going to hear about later. There's all the discussion about rewilding degraded landscape, or even urban greening. These are all nature-based, good example of nature-based solution.
Fantastic, thank you. So it's clear that there's very complex interactions, but sounds like there are kind of many-fold benefits to combining these two things together with one another. We've had a quick question come through already, which is fantastic. Those of you that would like to add your questions, if you head to pigeonhole.at/1826. 1826 is easy to remember because it is the year that ZSL was founded. Easy for us to remember anyway. But the question we've had through, Natalie, has said that it's really good to hear about positive actions that benefit communities and wildlife, as well as climate change, but that these will need huge financial and political commitments. We can maybe explore this a bit further towards the end of the session once we've brought in our other speakers, but are you optimistic about this, is the question.
I think anyone that works in conservation has to remain optimistic. And we have seen some good signs this week. I'm sure some of you have seen the private sector pledging a number of billions of dollars towards conservation. There is a real understanding that the climate change crisis is something we can address by helping bringing back nature. So yes, I am optimistic, but I would say that I can understand why people are quite worried by the scale of this, because the shift in investment needs to be major to really make this work. But there is some goodwill, and this is a good time to really ask for this.
There feels like a lot of momentum out there at the moment, pushing towards COP26 later this autumn. So fingers crossed that we can raise our voices loud enough and speak to the right people. So first of all, we're going to be exploring some examples of these nature-based solutions through some of the work that ZSL does. And we're going to head first of all over to Mongolia to speak to a colleague of ours who works out there. So I will introduce now Dr. Tunga Ulambaya, who is Country Director of ZSL's Mongolia Representative Office. So Tunga, people are very familiar with the idea of planting trees as a way to offset emissions and the importance of forest protection to help with the climate crisis. But forests are of particular importance to Mongolians, we understand. Is that right? Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
So yeah, thank you very much for this very great opportunity to be in this panel. So of course, forest is very important for Mongolia. As you know, Mongolia is like country sandwiched between Russia and China, and then about like 9% of the territory is forest land. It's like 14 million hectare area mainly because Mongolia itself is not small country, you know, like, and we are most sparsely populated country in the world because per square kilometer we have like 1.5 people basically. So, so even though we're like small population in the large country, you know, we have this nomadic culture. People have 5 different livestock, grazing rangelands and forest land, etc. And then they make use a lot of like forest resources, like not only like for their building houses and using that traditional making traditional Mongolian gear, you know, this round uh, um, shelters, and also like for houses, etc., and for just daily uses, you know, firewood and you know lots of non-timber products like nuts, fruits, and then some medicinal herbs that are so important for Mongolians. But now, like these days, we having climate change affecting both like forest ecosystem and rangeland ecosystem. For example, in Mongolia, like average temperature increase was 3 times more than the global average, you know? So we having much more like intensified kind of heating. And then secondly, also the precipitation, you know, the volume of rain and snow is decreasing in Mongolia, across Mongolia. And lastly, frequency and severity of some disaster, you know, like climatic events, like snow blizzard and, you know, like wind storms, etc. These are like increasing. For example, in Mongolia, we used to have such kind of like large magnitude disasters like every 10 years, but now it's like becoming more frequent, like around like every 8 or 7 years. Now the herders experiencing that kind of events. So so yeah, so that's about the forest and then how forest is affected by climate change.
Amazing. And so you are working in the ZSL team that we have out in Mongolia, trying to kind of mitigate these impacts, kind of make a shift. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work out there, what you guys are working on doing?
Well, the DSL is actually functioning in Mongolia since 2003, and then currently we have 7 colleagues working for the DSL Mongolia, and then we help actually government and then community people and researchers to really like conserve nature and then take action, nature-based solutions to that kind of adverse climatic events, you know, helping them adapt to climate change, also mitigate. And currently we have 2 projects, both funded by generous support of the UK people. So these are one is for wild camel protection in Great Gobi, which is like in southern Mongolia, and then the other one is strengthening ecological police capacity to tackle with the illegal wildlife trade. So these 2 projects, especially the one that in Gobi, and also one in central Mongolia, we're working with the community herders, community of the herders in local protected areas. And these 2 projects are so much relevant to climate change adaptation and tackling all those changes. like particularly in Arkhanga, which is like central Mongolia, we really helping local herders to protect their homeland, which is like around 137,000 hectare area. And then if you travel from one end to other end, it's usually like 200, 300 kilometers. It's like such a kind of strip of land, but this is habitat to endangered species like steppe falcon, musk deer, uh, also steppe eagle, argali sheep, wild sheep, basically. So we helping these local communities to protect those species and then habitat, and then also like now in Mongolia, what's the situation is like the herders don't have much information because they are so distant and remote, and then remote from major infrastructure. So that's why they don't have much access to information. Uh, like since Mongolia moved from socialism to market economy, they are quite, didn't have any opportunity to learn about the recent happenings, basically globally and nationally, etc. So ZSL is really facilitating that access to information, access to education to be available to those forced communities in Mongolia.
Amazing. It does sound like you have some quite unique challenges, given that you given the sparse population, but the high impact of climate change to what's going on out there, and also how remote those individuals are. It's incredible to hear about the work that you guys are doing. Amazing. Thank you very much for your time, Tunga. We'll definitely come back to you as we come on with more questions towards the end of today's session. But I wanted to kind of move from the forests of Mongolia to the world's oceans now to introduce another one of my colleagues to ask some similar questions. I'm going to introduce Heather Coldaway, who is a senior technical advisor to ZSL and has been working on marine and freshwater water conservation for a long time now. Heather, so the impact of climate change on the world's oceans, sea level rise, ocean acidification, all of those things are so well known that they're taught in schools these days. But I understand that there are a number of other ways in which the ocean is relevant to these climate change discussions. Could you explain a little bit more about some of the ways in which the ocean is involved in climate and sort of can be involved in mitigating the crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Yeah, I may be far from Tunga, but I am connected through the fact we are on one planet, and it is a blue planet, and we have the land, we have the ocean, we have the whole climate system and our weather, which we in the UK love to chat about. But it's all connected. It's one connected system, and so when we're thinking about climate change and its impact, it's basically a global impact. But the ocean is right at the heart of that. And in fact, it's quite a good way of thinking about it. So in the same way that the human heart takes blood and sort of oxygen and sort of pumps that around the body, and it regulates the body's temperature, the ocean is playing the same role for our planet. And so it plays an enormous role in that sort of regulatory side of things. But obviously, as we've shifted the balance and changed things in terms of the impact that we're having through our activities, and that's leading to lots of excess heat and lots of excess carbon dioxide, then that's causing a really big problem. And the ocean's actually bearing the brunt of that. So the ocean's absorbed about 90% of the excess heat that we've produced through our activities and about 40% of carbon dioxide. But to put that in a sort of terms that really brings it to life how serious that is, the ocean has been absorbing the same amount of heat as a atomic bomb the size of Hiroshima going off every second for the last 150 years. So that's the role that the ocean's been playing, and obviously that's not sustainable at all, and it's having more and more of an impact. And you touched on some of those when you gave some of those examples. So it's everything from the sea level rise, warming of sea temperatures, and while that for us in our chilly waters of the UK may sound quite a nice thing, that obviously is not designed for the species and habitats that we have anywhere, and so those species and habitats can't cope with those changes in temperatures. So we see things in areas that I work in the Indian Ocean, things like coral bleaching, where corals warm, they lose their symbiotic algae basically by being so stressed that they can't cope. And then if the temperatures don't drop again, then unfortunately those reefs die. And we've seen in the last major global bleaching event, 1/3 of the reefs of the world being affected. So it's not just a sort of small thing. This is something that's substantially impacting at a global level.
Thank you very much. So that's sort of the large scale impact that this issue is having on the oceans. Are there ways in which the ocean is helping and can help maybe more in the future, or aspects of it that we could potentially need to look at in terms of when we think about conserving the biodiversity of the oceans that could help with the sort of crisis more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is seeing the ocean as part of this important climate system, and sort of not seeing, separating forests and ocean, but actually seeing this as all as one system, and recognizing there's a cause and effect, and that's very far-reaching. And the second thing is tools that we use are things like protected areas. So the same as that we have on land is actually, if we can protect parts of the ocean and ensure that those systems are well looked after and stay healthy, that's a really good way of reducing the impact and building some resilience in the system that prevents some of the worst impacts of climate change. And we have these really amazing carbon cycles going on in the ocean that may range from things like mangroves that actually trap more carbon than tropical forests. So keeping mangrove systems protected and intact is really important. And even things like whales and whales that even just through pooping take large amounts of carbon through that system to the bottom of the ocean. And when whales die at the end of their life and sink to the bottom, that's another really important part of the carbon cycle. So the ocean sediments, deep ocean, mangroves and the shallower coastal areas are really important parts of trapping carbon. But obviously the priority, as well as protecting and restoring those important ocean habitats, is to reduce the amount of emissions that we're making and our impact, because this is a human created problem. And while we can use these nature-based solutions, some of those are just buying us time that must go hand in hand with some major policy commitments and changing the way we do things currently to build a sustainable future for the planet.
Fantastic, thank you. So in terms of the work that you have done over the years with ZSL, and the work that ZSL is kind of currently doing, there's a particular focus in the Indian Ocean on protected areas and things like that. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about how that work has kind of developed over the years, and just how that protected area might link through to these kind of discussions as a nature-based solution potentially to the climate crisis?
Yeah, the Indian Ocean is, first of all, we only have one ocean on the planet. So this is really sort of geographical definitions of one body of water. But the Indian Ocean area is the fastest warming, the most poorly studied and the most poorly regulated ocean area on the planet. So one of the reasons for focus is that that's a huge area where we can fill knowledge gaps. And the second was that for well over a decade, we helped provide the scientific evidence that led to one of the largest protected areas, the marine protected areas on the planet, called the Chagos Archipelago. And this is about the size of France. So we're really talking a significant area of ocean, and that protects small islands. It protects the largest living coral reef. It has mangroves, it has seagrasses, and then it has all of these incredible species from seabirds and sea turtles, sharks, tunas. And so what we've been doing is, as well as helping with the management of that protected area, is to understand how well that builds resilience for things like coral reefs in the face of climate change, and also how well does it protect species that move. So the ocean is one big connected system. So if there's a turtle that then migrates thousands of kilometers across the ocean, how do these protected areas work for it? And what we find is that it's a really important part of how we conserve species. So if you can protect the nesting beaches for turtles, then that's a really obviously important step in their life cycle. And also through our other studies, we found that many of the species that do move long distances actually stay within the archipelago and in that protected area for their whole life. That's seabirds like red-footed boobies, manta rays. And so this is a real refuge, a haven for these really threatened species that are threatened in other parts of the world. And now we're working across the region with regional partners from Sri Lanka, India, Maldives, Seychelles, and so on, to work regionally and cooperatively. So we work together to build a network of protected areas and really help these incredible species that live in that part of the world.
What do you find, it's probably a really big question, but what do you find are the key kind of challenges to that sort of work and the work that you do out in the Indian Ocean?
I think the hardest thing for me is this enormous area is fully protected. So nobody's allowed to fish or do any other kind of damaging activities. And having worked out there for many years, to go back to the first time I went there, it was like visiting the highlights of a nature documentary. You know, you've got these amazing islands with these seabirds everywhere, you know, like in a three-dimensional cloud of seabirds. You're on the reefs, you're surrounded by fish, nothing's scared of you because they've never been fished. It's absolutely stunning. And then to live through a coral bleaching event, and unfortunately we saw back-to-back bleaching events there through from 2015, 2016, was heartbreaking, because those reefs turned into skeletons, and it was almost like a ghost town in certain areas. And realizing that even though this was a fully protected area, we still couldn't control the impacts of climate change, which are everywhere. What was encouraging, though, is that because it is fully protected and it doesn't have other stresses, the corals are able to recover quicker and faster and better than they can if there was still the impacts of things like fishing or coastal development. So there's still, and that's part of the research that we're doing, it provides a really important reference site compared to other areas. But that's, to me, really brought home how we have to tackle these issues of climate change globally. And while this is certainly a really important, that marine protected areas and protected areas on land are vital nature-based solutions, we also have to do our bit. We can't just expect nature just to pick up all of the costs of the impact that we're having on our planet.
Thank you very much, Heather. We have had quite a lot of questions coming through, which I think are a few of them are kind of definitely applicable to more than one of us. So I'm just going to move on to our final speaker. If you've got any more questions, by the way, do please pop them on Pigeonhole. The address is on the screen there as well. I'm going to move on to our final speaker so we can bring Alison in, and then we will move on to questions that kind of are applicable to most people. Because even right back here in the UK, our work has links to the climate crisis. So Alison Debney works on coastal marine ecosystems with a focus of those around the UK. So Alison, some of the coastal habitats we have here are particularly good at capturing carbon. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about, people might not be as aware of that there are different types of coastal ecosystem around the UK, and which of those are particularly relevant in these discussions?
Okay. Well, we have a wide range of coastal ecosystems here in the UK as well, but some of them I would like to draw our attention to today are seagrasses, salt marsh, oyster reefs, but also kelp. Now we need to think of these in our temperate environment a bit like the seagrasses, coral reefs and mangroves of the tropics. They're coastal systems, and each of them have a very important role to play in helping us adapt and mitigate to climate change. First of all, salt marsh is an incredible habitat. It's you've got annual vegetation growing on tidally inundated waters. Now the vegetation grows, but when it dies, it doesn't actually rot down. It will go into the mud and go into the sediment, trapping the carbon that it takes in through its growing. And then when you get tidal inundation, you get layering of mud, and slowly you're just locking all this carbon into the ground. So therefore, it acts as a massive carbon store, helping us, sequester carbon. I think it's like 5 tons per hectare per year of carbon is tucked away. Similarly with seagrass, you've got a very fast growing plant in the sea. And again, when that breaks down, it doesn't break down and the carbon doesn't go back into the system, but it goes, breaks down very slowly in this anoxic, a sediment with no oxygen. And again, the carbon stays stored away. Similarly with kelp, kelp is often very overlooked, but it's a hugely fast growing algae that lives in the sea. It's in a big brown algae, temperate environment, you find it on rocky shores. But this grows 30 to 50 times faster than a tropical forest. It takes carbon dioxide out of the water, so it addresses some of the acidification issues that Heather was talking about, causing the bleaching. But also, again, when it breaks down, it doesn't just go back into the atmosphere, the carbon will fall down and go into the deep, again, blocking the carbon out of the way. So all these coastal habitats make a massive contribution to us managing carbon, the excess carbon in our environment.
Thank you. That's amazing to hear about kind of just the impact they can have. So we have all these incredible ecosystems. What's happening around the UK and what's the sort of status of them? Are they thriving? Are they not thriving? I think we probably know the answer, but it would be lovely to hear a little bit more about what's going on.
Well, here we go. Here are the numbers. So salt marsh, we've lost 85% of our salt marsh in the last in the last 150 years. The site that we work in Essex, we've lost 1,000 hectares in the last 50 years. Seagrass, we've lost 50% in the last 35 years. Oyster reefs, we've lost 95%. Kelp, we don't even know, because when you go to look for it, you find it's gone. Basically, it's been dredged out, and basically we don't know how much we've lost. There's an interesting number from Australia that when they actually looked at kelp, they realised it was 30% of their carbon store was in the kelp forests on their coasts. So yeah, we've done a pretty good job of destroying these amazing habitats that can be the form of our nature-based solutions. And climate has done a lot. Actually, climate change or climate-induced change has done a lot to push these habitats to extremely stressed conditions. Again, like as Heather was saying, around it's a global issue. So we're getting the global impacts here in the UK. We're getting sea level rise. That is causing greater erosion of our salt marshes. We put big defences around it, so they've got no room to move back and create a sedimentation. We've got ocean acidification, so that's affecting our reef-forming organisms and with the hard skeletals, whether it be cold corals or our shellfish. And these again provide us coastal protection. Salt marsh will use our protection, £1 billion worth of coastal protection salt marsh provides us with. And then, of course, the ocean sea temperatures warming. Natalie mentioned that at the beginning. We're seeing a shift in our species, and that's really affecting our ecosystem function. So again, causing massive stresses to our habitats. And when we lose our habitats, we lose all those goods and services they give us: the coastal protection, the food provision. They're really, really important nursery areas that then go and feed, support our wider fisheries. They clean the water. I work a lot with oysters, and the filter feeders take particulates and nutrients out of the water, gives light, seagrass grow. It's all interconnected, and we're all been hugely stressed by climate change.
We've had a question come through for you. Does the UK do enough to restore their coastal habitats? Do they have the same visibility as some of those other kind of habitats in the UK that get that protection, like peatlands, and their kind of impact in terms of the potential to help with the climate crisis?
Well, I think a few of us marine conservationists around this table, around the screen, will always shout out that ocean is often overlooked. We can see the peatlands, we can see the forest, but it's very hard to see below, beneath the surface of the water. And that's where we spend a lot of time trying to talk to people and let people experience our ocean in climate. We've been working hard at ZSL to try and change that and put the focus on oceans, but we're also trying to change the story that we need to do something about restoring these habitats. We have a protection system in the UK, protected areas, but what we've often protected is much depleted environments. And also these aren't fully protected environments, like Heather's talking about in the Indian Ocean, where nothing is supposed to happen. Actually, a lot of it is business as usual in our protected areas. So we still have dredging, we still have pollution going into it. So we're not actually really protecting. So we're really pushing at ZSL, and have been for the last 10 years, that we have to do active restoration. We have to give our ocean and our coastal areas a helping hand to get started till we get to the point of self-sustaining ecosystems. And we're doing that at ZSL. I can talk a bit about our work if you like.
Go for it. It'd be lovely to hear a little bit about what we're doing to help with this.
Well, so in my team, actually, we're leading at least 4 restoration projects around the UK, directly leading them. We have 3 native oyster restoration. I can talk a whole other hour about those, but I'll leave them aside. But that's in Northeast England and in Wales and in Scotland. But also in Essex, we've been chairing the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative as part of a much bigger blackwater conservation approach to restoring this incredible estuary in the coast. And here we're looking at integrated marine habitat restoration. So we're looking at our oyster reefs, but also looking at seagrass, and we're looking at salt marsh. And like we see the ecological connectivity in the tropics with the seagrass, the mangroves and the coral reefs, I've done the wrong transect, but we're also seeing that in the UK. So we're looking at the oyster reefs that then takes platelets out of the water, cleans the water, light down, greater seagrass growth. The oysters protect the seagrass from the wave attenuation, and that in turn then protects or allows the salt marsh to recover. So working in partners, we're putting down to get greater integrity in our salt marsh so that we get the coastal protection back. We're getting the seagrass to grow, removing pressures again, such as either dog walkers or windsurfers, or physical disturbance anchoring that we're doing. And then we're working to restore our oyster reefs together. So hopefully we get to this self-sustained ecosystem. But yeah, we're just doing 4 projects, and actually we want, we've got to scale up, and we have to do it. So a massive role that ZSLs play is to share that knowledge, that baseline knowledge, that best practice that our lessons that we've learned. And we do that by forming a network across of restoration practitioners, so sharing technical knowledge, and also producing sort of how-to guidance so that people, community groups, whoever wants to, can start looking at doing these small-scale restoration projects. It doesn't have to be big, but if we start getting this piecemeal and this connectivity between it, we start seeing restoration of our ocean.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm just going to jump to our final speaker, because we've just been joined by Georgine Primavera, who has managed to join our call fantastically. It was a marine biologist leading efforts to bring back mangroves in the Philippines. Thank you so much for joining us, Georgine. It's lovely to see you. We've mentioned a little bit about mangroves across the different kind of other people's sections on today. But you've been working on them for many years. In fact, you were part of the group that set up the IUCN Mangrove Specialist Group near 10 years ago that focuses on kind of coordinating research and conservation of these very important ecosystems. Would you be able to tell everyone a little bit about what mangroves are, just why they're such an important coastal ecosystem, and why they are relevant to climate change discussions?
Good evening to everyone. Sorry I'm late. I think I missed the time conversion there. Anyway, of course, mangroves are these intertidal trees and shrubs, that really offer a variety of goods and services. Some valuation studies give a figure of $14,000 to $16,000 per hectare, but some say that's quite conservative. Anyway, goods would be, from the forests, fuel for local communities, honey, and more importantly, the fisheries products, both permanent residents like shellfish that you can harvest from the mangroves, or even fish, and also temporary residents that use the mangroves as nurseries, fish, shrimps, crabs that go out offshore, but they spend a very important part of the early life stages in the mangroves. Of course, the services, this is where climate change comes in. First, we have regulation of floods, nutrient recycling, control of erosion, and in terms of climate change, first, we know that climate change, we have global warming, which is mostly driven by greenhouse gases, number one of which is carbon dioxide. And therefore, we need carbon sinks to absorb the carbon in the atmosphere. And what better living things to do that than plants, through photosynthesis, using CO2 and light energy. And in terms of photosynthesis and carbon capture or storage, not all forests are equal, because mangroves capture carbon and sequester it at 4 to 5 times the rate of other forests. So they're really, really critical for climate change. And also, in terms of impacts of climate change, we know sea level rise, and also increasing storm frequency and storm intensity. And so mangroves have a critical role there in coastal protection. And there's lots of studies that show that with mangrove vegetation providing coastal protection as green belts or bioshields with other associated vegetation like beech forests, this can absorb or attenuate or reduce wave energy by up to 60%, even 100%. And the green belt, I think the computations have been done that at least 100-meter wide green belt will reduce at least 60% of the wave energy. And lastly, and not to forget, historically and culturally, because many places, coastal places, have mangrove-based names. In the Philippines, our premier city of Manila comes from the mangrove Scyphiphora hydrophyllacea, so that in the olden times, the local people would say, oh, that place is Maynilad. There is Nilad, or there is Scyphiphora. And Manila Bay, at that time, 1,500 years before the present, had 74,000 hectares of mangroves. Can you imagine that? So Maynilad was shortened, or some say was bastardized to Manila, because the Spanish could not pronounce the consonants, the Y and the D. So in brief, but I don't think that was too brief, that's the importance of mangroves.
No, very much huge importance. So in the Philippines where you work, most mangrove forests, am I right in thinking that we've lost a huge amount of the mangrove that's out there? I was wondering if you could give us a bit of an update on why mangrove has been lost out there, and also kind of what work is being done to try and bring it back or restore what's or protect what's still there.
Wow. Mangroves in the Philippines have declined from, some say, 500,000 hectares or more to, in the 1970s, to only 137,000 hectares. But right now, it's been brought up to 240,000 hectares. The main cause of the decline would be brackish water pond culture, because that's where the ponds were constructed. You go out to the mangrove, because at the time, wastelands were considered wetlands with no value at all. So to make use of these wastelands, the manual would say how to build a pond. Go out to the mangroves, number 1. Cut the trees, number 2. Dig a hole, number 3. Let water in, number 4, and stock the fish. And that's, voila, you have a fish pond. And that would be the best use of mangroves. So that was the thinking at the time. Of course, it's changed a lot since then. But that's the number 1 cause of the decline. Another cause would be local harvests, small-scale harvesting, and lack of law enforcement, because in the Philippines, mangroves are protected. They have blanket protection, but there's not much, well, there is some enforcement, but not enough. So that's the cause of the decline of mangroves in the Philippines. And I did have some notes, but anyway.
And how is the protection working, or what kind of work is being done out there in order to try and mitigate this impact?
Okay.
Briefly, and then we'll head on to kind of more wider questions for all the speakers.
Okay. Going back to the 1960s, 70s, already there have been mangrove replanting efforts, no? But no science, not science-based. It's planting by convenience. So in the wrong sites, mainly along the seafront, which in the Philippines, we have a very narrow fringing mangrove. So low survival rates, but anyway, that's where planting is done. A lot of money, billions of dollars, because the photo ops is great. It's very convenient. It's open access. You won't get shot. There's no conflict. Instead of planting in abandoned ponds, because that's where mangroves used to be. They used to be there. Now they're fish ponds, and the ponds, by law, it's mandated that they should go back to mangroves, but it's not happening. So it's the wrong site, and to a lesser extent, it's the wrong species that's being planted. That's Rhizophora, which is not the dominant species along the seafront. It's two other species. But then these are very easy to procure and very easy to plant. So it's really planting by convenience. So in the wrong way, yeah.
So more coordination needs to be kind of implemented, hopefully going forwards. Thank you, Georgine, for that kind of overview of the importance. It's an incredible ecosystem that I'm not sure that too many people would know too much about. We've got some time now for some questions, and I've had a nice question come through for you, Tunga, about the young people of Mongolia, and whether young people in Mongolia are actively putting any pressure on the Mongolian government to address climate change, sort of as they are in Western Europe and elsewhere that we've seen kind of in the news and on our streets. You will need to unmute yourself, I'm afraid, Tunga. Thank you.
Yeah, apologies. Yeah, thank you very much for question. That's an interesting question, because in Mongolia we have this eco club culture kind of thing, like across like rural schools in urban areas. Kids get together, join these eco clubs, and for example, now we will be working in Great Gobi with 5 rural districts. I mean, like, it's in Mongolian, we call them som. So like there are eco clubs, and we will be working with them how to, increase the public awareness of the people, why we need to protect endangered species, why we need to collaborate with the conservationists, researchers, etc. And so from that perspective, I think youth is quite active in Mongolia. They're not only saying like it's climate change, but it's more like their effort is for conservation side, and also, like, I would say in urban areas, their efforts is more like the fighting with the pollution, for example, wastes, and more like creating green environment, etc. There are lots of like public art kind of stuff that youth are kind of leading, lots of like street art, and then Mongolian dances, etc. So that people, they can contribute to public awareness raising. There are lots of like art competitions regarding like how we can tackle desertification, climate change, and conserving like rare species, etc. Yeah.
Fantastic to hear. Thank you. We have also had a question through about whether kind of protected areas, whether these nature-based solutions are really going to be able to offset the kind of vast greenhouse gas emissions and really have the impact that's required in terms of this issue. I'm not kind of sure who the best person, probably Natalie, to say a couple of words on that, if you'd like to.
Yes, I think it's important that it's to understand that it's not a neither nor scenario. It's a both together. you have to increase storage of carbon and capture of carbon from the atmosphere, and you have to massively reduce emission. And that works. We know it works because we have made a lot of simulation to show that if you protect enough, if you restore enough, if you reduce those emissions, we are going to go back to a balance. But they need to work together. There's no point in opposing them.
Fantastic. Do we feel that, there's another question that's come through, do you feel that biodiversity and ecosystem protection is getting enough focus in the wider climate change discussions and commitments so far? A lot of the share of the voice is focused on carbon emissions reductions and not necessarily this side of things. And Natalie can probably answer that as well, but I wondered if anyone else had any kind of perspectives they'd like to add also.
I'll chip in there. I think the short answer is no, but that's obviously the opportunity of events like this and talking more widely on how things are so integrated. So there isn't a climate or biodiversity or climate or ocean. It's all one thing that we need to pull together. And a paper published this week that Natalie led and really articulates that very, very clearly of the mechanics and the importance of bringing those conversations much more closely together and setting up the frameworks to do that in the policy arena.
Fantastic. We've also got a question through as to whether you have any of the speakers have experienced nations or governments who are leading the way or providing a model for how other countries should follow in their approach for solving kind of the climate change crisis. Whether you've seen any particularly good examples or anyone you would hold up. Has anyone got any thoughts?
I mean, I think it's not systematically useful to try to look at who does best because no one's doing nearly enough. So what we know is that countries that haven't created this situation are probably doing much more, given that they didn't create the situation, than the ones that are primarily responsible for the climate change crisis and biodiversity crisis, that's for sure. So the one that I would applaud is the one that are making effort, even though they are very far from being the main country responsible for the emergencies we are facing.
Thank you very much. We've had quite a lot of questions through about, we've obviously seen, we know that the COP26 coming up is when the government are going to be talking about, or world leaders talking about what they're hopefully going to be doing. You guys have discussed lots of ways in which ZSL is using these nature-based solutions to potentially try and make change. But are there things that individuals can do at home? We've had a question through about whether sort of what can individuals do to reduce their carbon footprint? How can we pressure government to take action? Will messaging local MPs help with getting the government to do more? And I wondered what you guys thought or the important aspects were from a personal level, and what kind of difference can be made, which I suppose might be different here in the UK as opposed to the Philippines, Mongolia. So it'd be interesting to hear from each of you potentially about this.
Maybe I'll start from a terrestrial point of view, and I think Heather can and Alison can really pick on the marine aspect, and then Tunga and Judging from an international aspect. From the UK point of view, absolutely, this is Big Green Week. You should email your MP. You should put pressure on your representatives so that they do something about climate. I think from the point of active personal action, I think it's really important to understand that the one that really need to do something are the government and the private sector. But yes, every single action counts. So, for example, reducing your reliance on animal, so consuming meat or dairies, that makes a bit of a difference. Taking the train and not whenever you can, instead of taking a short haul plane, that make a bit of a difference. All those little things add up, insulation, good isolation of your home, reliance on electricity instead of gas whenever you can. But we need the government to support those changes because they need to happen quickly and they need to happen at scale. I'll pass it on to Heather and Alison.
Yes, I mean, obviously reason it becomes important to governments is when people who vote them into power feel it's a topic that's important and is going to win votes. So making it very clear that that does matter, that the planet matters, nature matters, and them delivering climate change commitment matters is really important. And also to emphasize the fact that, you know, choices do make change, and it's very difficult to be perfect. And I think people always think, well, I need to be perfect and do everything properly, but actually just starting today with action helps. And that might be writing the letter, or it might be doing, you know, an action in your home, or deciding not to do certain things. But don't worry about being perfect from the outset. Just work on doing something and starting today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heather. I wondered if either Georgine or should we start with you, Georgine, about in the Philippines, kind of what advice would you have, what people could do on an individual basis? Or you just need to unmute yourself, I'm afraid.
Very quickly before that, the question about biodiversity. Here in the Philippines, you know, the COVID pandemic has really brought that to the fore, because the zoonosis, you know, there you can make the point that we've lost that biodiversity because of all the land use change, and so the pandemics, you know, the viruses have come and so on. Anyway, so to your question of what on a personal level, in the developing world, we don't have so much material consumption, but there's one thing that we do have, and that's the use of plastics. And you know, just blindly follow what's being done in other parts of the more developed world. And of course also the packaging, you know, it's the packaging of companies. So on a very personal level, when I have the chance in my lectures, you know, a plastic toothbrush and a wooden toothbrush, Heather knows this, and then native packaging of foods, you know, banana leaves and rather than plastics, and just it's the whole thing. And it's I think the information on microplastics should be getting out there, because now it's really to that level. We don't know what it's, oh yes, we do, in fact, to some degree, what it's doing to our own bodies. So that on that, I think on a personal level, that's really an advocacy very close to my heart, because when I was a child in the 1950s, there were no plastics. Okay, no plastics, everything biodegraded. So that came in my lifetime. Yeah.
Thank you, Georgine. And Tunga, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Sure, yeah. Like regarding that challenges that forests are facing in Mongolia, I said about the climate change, but I would like to add that actually human activities, negative human impact on the forest is very like several types of issues facing in Mongolia, and that's connected to how everybody can contribute to climate change elevation, you know, like addressing climate change. So in Mongolia, for example, we are cold country, have long winters, so we have lots of livestock. So that's why that overgrazing issue is like number one human impacted kind of issue. And then the second is mining, you know, like when Mongolia is a rich country in terms of like minerals. So we have lots of mining ongoing, both like formal industrial mining and also we call this artisanal, you know, small informal mining. So that's also affecting a lot. And then lastly, like logging, you know, when you do logging, poaching, that illegal activities. So when you trying to really at the individual level, trying to contribute to climate change action, then probably like, for example, at the herder level, it has to be like reducing your livestock, you know, and then like have more like alternative incomes. But of course, in Mongolia, like as Natalie was saying, that people cannot like move to vegetarianism or whatever, because we are a cold country and Mongolians are largely meat-eating people. But anyway, by the way, in Mongolia, there is a quite number of people moving to veganism and vegetarianism or whatever that, you know, non-meat eating community. And I think among them, the youth are quite number of people. And then the second thing is I agree with Georgine, because like in Mongolia, that plastics are really like a big problem. Traditionally, also Mongolians used to have always like biodegradable kind of wastes, like animal or whatever, wood, all that, kind of organic kind of wastes. But now with plastics, people, especially in countryside, people lack understanding that these things can stay whatever years in the nature. So as I said, like there is a gap in terms of like accessing knowledge, education, etc. So like at individual level, we really need to like increase people awareness, and then also like tackle with the plastics.
Thank you very much, Tunga. So we've come to the end of our time. Just before we finish, I wanted just to have, I have one very quick question for Natalie. Given that it's Big Green Week and it's all about action on climate change, if everybody watching this this video, whether live or later, could do one thing, what would you want them to do, Natalie? What action could they take individually?
I think if they could all think about one thing they want to reduce, either dependency to dairies and beef, or thinking about walking a little bit more, or emailing your MP, or getting just more aware about the issue, and just do one thing but do it. I think that would be it. I don't think there's a one easy solution. Different people have different things they want to do, but if they can do it, that I think makes the difference.
What you want them to do is do it. Brilliant. I think that's great advice. Thank you so much to all our speakers today for joining us. And thank you so much to everybody that has been watching. If you are interested in finding out more about the recent research on nature-based solutions, you can head to the Nature-Based Solutions Hub on ZSL's website, which is on the screen now at zsl.org/nature@heart. Or you can join Natalie for our next online science and conservation event, which will be taking place on Tuesday, the 12th of October. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope I'll say goodbye, and I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.